Well, I'm Phil Cooke, and welcome to the Phil Cooke Podcast. Today, we've got an incredible guest, Micah Bickham, multi-camera director, incredibly creative guy. He's based in New York City, doing some remarkable things with major rock and roll acts all over the country. And you're going to be fascinated with talking to him. I've known him for more than 10 or 15 years back in his early days when he started at Lakewood Church in Houston, Texas. And now he's risen to become a major multicam director doing some of the biggest acts in rock and roll these days. So you're going to enjoy that conversation. Before we go there, I just want to remind you that I wrote a book a number of years ago called One Big Thing, Discovering What You Were Born to Do. And the interesting thing about the book is it's really designed for people who are struggling to figure out what they were put on the earth to accomplish. What I'm supposed to do with my life. I meet people in their 40s, 50s, 60s, even 70s sometimes who will say, Phil, I've been busy, I've been successful, but I've never known what I was put here to accomplish with my life. Well, you're going to find out if you read this book. If you're struggling with your career, if you're trying to figure out what your thing really is, what your calling, what your purpose, what your gift really is, this book is going to help you do it. You can get it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, whatever. It's available, and I'd encourage you to check it out because it just could change the direction of your life. Micah, I'm thrilled that you're here on the podcast. It's been a long time since we've talked in person, quite a few years, actually. You've got a long way since I saw you last, but I've been hearing about your career, and you've been amazing, so thanks for coming on.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me, dude. It's I'm glad to connect after all this time.
Well, it's interesting for me. We had Steve Lester on the podcast a number of months ago, and I always like connecting with multi-camera directors because that's where I came from.
Yeah.
But when I was young, multi-camera was normal. There were television specials, concert shows on all the time, and it was pretty normal. And then a generation came along that grew up with YouTube and is brilliant with single cameras, but have no clue what to do with multiple cameras. How did you bridge that gap? How did you get started doing multiple cameras?
Yeah. I mean, I admittedly I have a very strange path into filmmaking just in general. It's really interesting. I was talking to somebody the other day, and then we were having this very same conversation. And it's, I'll start with the premise that I didn't go to film school. I didn't have a traditional kind of film education. And even more so, like, didn't really have an interest in filmmaking at all, really. I wanted to play music my whole life. I wanted to travel and be in bands, and I did that for a number of years, in and amongst college and sometime after. And man, I just kind of fell into it. Obviously, you have a really strong and deep relationship with Lakewood Church in Houston.
Sure.
And we were in Houston for my wife's grad school, and I was leading worship at a church at that point in time, but was also trying to pursue like music in my own kind of space, writing and playing with other bands. And
Right.
there were a couple of bandmates that I played music with, who were playing music at Lakewood, and
Okay.
I did a little bit of editing. We can talk about that. Like, I have a very strange sort of editing background as well. But through that process, my buddies essentially kind of lied through their teeth to John, who runs the broadcast
John
department there.
Swearingen, yeah.
John Swearingen, yeah. And basically said I had the skill set that I just did not have, for me as like a musician, I was just looking for something that was creative in some capacity, but was just paying the bills and kind of buying my time while I could kind of continue to make music work. So I fell into film in a very, very strange capacity. And my falling into it was live entertainment. It was live production at Lakewood Church.
That's fantastic. It's so funny that you at least fell into it in a really good place. What I find is that in most churches that I work with and deal with, they don't understand why directing matters. And so they just put a volunteer on, and they just call it switching. We're just going to have our volunteer switch cameras. And I find some churches, they dissolve everything. I don't care how upbeat it is and how, loud things get. They're going to dissolve super slow and everything. Others don't know anything about dissolving. And it's just, they don't really understand that how important it is to capture a performance.
Yeah.
And very few multi-camera directors today do it well.
Yeah, I had the very good fortune of, like I'm saying, I fell into this thing, and it was not of interest to me until it began to be. And I slowly, even though I kind of sort of finagle my way into this position I might have been unqualified for, I had a very deep and strong sort of like commitment to hard work, and I knew early on like I could do the job. I remember early on, John would come into the edits, the edit bay, and I was editing at the beginning of my time there. He'd be like, "Hey, yeah, let's do an insert edit there, and we'll drop a graphic here." And I'm taking notes, and he'd go away, and I would Google, Google.com, what is an insert edit?
Yes.
But I just learned I learned very very quickly, and it was very baptism by fire in that sense. I'm very very fortunate that John saw in me very early on, because of my musical background, that
Yeah.
I had a propensity for what multi-camera directing would be, which is it's very kinetic, it's very musical in a certain
Yeah.
sense. So what that looked like early on, that was me dolly gripping camera 5. I don't know if you remember the old show.
Yeah.
There was a low wide dolly on the downstage, and I pushed that dolly for a better part of 6 months. And as frustrating as that was, what it allowed me to do is it allowed me to kind of understand, his sensibilities and his pace, and the language and the communication, which is, as we can talk about, is
Yeah.
like, part of directing is it's about language, and it's about efficiency of language, and it's about proper communication. It's all of these things wrapped up in I was able to kind of like, in a very safe environment, like have the groundwork for what
Yeah.
that looked like. And then I began to like technical direct. John said, "Hey, I think you can do this function." And for those that don't know, the technical director in a live environment is it operates the vision, the vision mixer and the switcher in a traditional kind of broadcast scenario, and they're
Right.
they're an extension of the director's cues. So as they're calling cameras, the technical directors functionally making those cues go to air. And so again, same thing. Like, here's this device with hundreds and hundreds of buttons and a great, a deep menu of options. And I just had to like learn. I'd pull out the menu, and I had to figure out how does all of this work. And slowly but surely began to kind of build that muscle and that language for what it would ultimately be directing. I'm just thankful for, I think, you and I are kind of linked in that way, because I don't know much about you and John's kind of
John used to
history.
work for me. When John was a student in
That's
college, he
right.
worked for me.
That's
Yeah,
right.
and
That's right.
so we've been friends for a long time.
Yeah. So like the best practices that he was teaching me, he learned from you, and he learned from Joel, and from
Yeah.
others. And I'm very thankful that there were people, Joel included, early on when I didn't know what I was doing. There were people who were willing to show like an interest in my raw talent, and were like willing to give me a
Good.
chance.
That's good.
So
Well,
that's kind of, I mean, that's my beginning. That's my beginning, kind of in a nutshell, of how I got into this thing.
I love the fact that you Googled stuff, because I always tell people starting off in their career, never say no. When somebody offers you an opportunity or a
Yeah.
project, just because you can't do it, don't say no. Just say yes, and then go research like crazy and figure it out. I think that's a really important way to do it. And it's also
Yeah.
interesting to me that your background was music. I think what helped me, actually started college as a music major, and I
Mm.
switched to television and film, but I'd played piano my whole life, and I can lay out a chart and direct based on that. I don't have to have someone next to me saying, "Okay, the electric guitar is coming in here, or the
Right.
trombone's going to play in a second."
Right.
You could just see what's coming, and it makes a big difference for a director. And it's probably helped you a lot in music as well.
Yeah, I mean, even now that I work with large, high profile artists, and to have the ability to speak in a musicality, like in
Yeah,
the language of song structure and form, and to be able to have that um, ability, is, I think, oftentimes in production, especially, is kind of a rare commodity. And
yeah,
so it's definitely one of those things where, you know, I use music in a weird way in filmmaking much more than I ever thought that I would.
yeah,
My connection to being musical, in other words, is much closer. But like, because my starting point was live, all of my contemporaries and my friends and buddies who were creative, and interested in film, they all jumped into commercial or to single camera narrative or documentary or,
Right.
um, you know, and I just didn't have that interest. And so, it answers the question you asked earlier, which is like, how did you get into live production? It's just like, it's the only thing that I just accidentally fell into. And I'll say, like, it's changed over time. But when I started in
Hmm.
live production, it it didn't have the class that it has now. It was kind of a less cool version of production, but I found that to be
Yes.
very interesting,
Yeah,
how
that's
you could
really
make
interesting.
how you could make something that was very traditional television.
Yep.
How could I come in and be a bit of a, without a formal education, how could I be a bit of a disruptor in the space? And that's really been, even at Lakewood, but even now, like, that's really my, like, when people ask what is your vision for a project, or how do you approach a project coming in as a director, I'm really looking at finding ways to disrupt, conventional, very traditional live production elements. So a lot of times that is like, it's taking tools from traditional cinema filmmaking and applying them to a live environment. To me, that's interesting
Great.
because it's really looking left when everybody else is looking right to create something in a live space. So yeah, that's like,
So,
yeah.
what percentage of the projects you're doing now are shooting a live concert and using that as the basis of the event or the show, whatever, versus going into a studio and making something up?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say by and large, my work now is, it relies heavily on an artist who's performing in a live scenario where, where the stakes for them are also high. So
Yeah.
they're performing in front of an audience, it's a very traditional live situation. But what we're doing, and what we work very, very hard to do is to take the DNA of traditional cinematography, whether that's lensing, camera bodies, even down to the types of crews that we hire. We work really, really hard to look for disruptors. Bringing it, and oftentimes it means bringing in people who have don't have the language or the bad habits of a live environment.
Yeah.
So they're bringing in a curiosity, which is seems counterintuitive, but
Mhm.
if you have a room full of people who've done the show that you're doing at that point in time as a director, if I
Yeah.
bring in if I bring in 65 people who are on this crew, and all of them have done every live show you could ever think of, you can imagine how, like, over time there becomes this, not laissez-faire, but like, we have the template. We know the template. So we're gonna work with the template that we know that works. Whereas if you bring in, and you really work hard to bring in a team of, people who have a background in live environments, but
Yep.
also those who don't, but have a curiosity of what this space is like, then you find that you create this class or team of people who, are just, like, wildly fascinated about them, and they approach the subject matter like they might approach a film or they might approach a documentary. And to me, that's very interesting. It leverages a new type of creative in a live environment we just haven't seen in the past.
Love that. So for people listening that don't know you, aren't familiar with you, give me an example of some of the artists you've worked with recently.
Well,
I
I
mean,
yeah,
you-
yeah, yeah. I just did an HBO special for an artist named The Weeknd, who's a big kind of pop R&B artist. Um, you know, prior to prior to that, I've worked with, artists like Doja Cat or Justin Bieber or Ariana Grande or, SZA, you know, Louis Capaldi. I mean, we could go on and on.
yeah.
It's I I what's really, really interesting for me is I've taken what is the background and foundation of my time, in ministry and in church, and I find, applying that in the space that I'm operating in now is really, really fitting for the kind of the work that I want to be doing.
Interesting.
I've loved the time that I had, at Lakewood, and it's been a really great evolution to kind of see some of that tradition and some of that ministry and some of that, like, kind of tact and approach to how you work in a ministry environment, applying that in these, um, these very kind of traditional environments where you don't typically have those kinds of approaches. Um, to me, that paradox and that contrast is really interesting, and it's very fitting for kind of my background. My dad's a pastor, and so I've grown up in ministry my whole life, but applying that into these other worlds has been really fun and very fulfilling for me.
That's
Um,
cool.
yeah,
That's fantastic. So let me ask you, from Lakewood to Vivo was a big leap. How did you get from one to the other? What was the door that opened that caused you to
yeah,
decide it's time to move on from Lakewood?
yeah. I tell people this often, which is at the point in which I left Lakewood, um, I wasn't ready to leave. I um, I owe Joel and Joel Osteen, who's the pastor at Lakewood, and John, who runs the department. I owe those guys kind of my whole career in life, and so I'm very loyal in that sense, and didn't really wasn't really interested or looking to kind of move on. I was parallel to my time at Lakewood. I began with another partner of mine. We began building a production company that was really kind of focused on it was focused on a cinematic approach to live multicam, which is kind of what I've been saying.
Yeah.
And we started very small. We started with bands that we knew, and then bands that became in town, and then over a number of years, that became more and more commissioned work. And a production company here in New York named Pulse Films reached out about about my partner and I directing a series of projects for a brand new partner of theirs, which was VEVO. VEVO is it's the world's largest music video distribution platform, and they also produce and create original content. And so we were coming in on behalf of the production company to make these live films for VEVO. And lo and behold, I met this group of people, and they were interesting, and they found me to be interesting. And 3 emails after that job, I was on a plane to New York to kind of have a what was kind of out of the blue conversation about me coming on to take on creative development, original content at VEVO.
Wow.
And so, you know, um, a Texan, with at that point in time 2 kids and no ambition to live in New York.
Yeah.
My wife and I just decided, like, it's a window that I think we'd be foolish to not to say yes to. And let's try it for a year. And if it doesn't work out, like, it doesn't work out. And it goes back to what you were saying before, which is like, being like passionate about where you are, but being like ready and available for opportunity and windows as they present themselves, was a big part of like the reason, so the way that I ended up kind of at VEVO the way I did. And I ended up staying at VEVO for about 7 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then you're freelancing full time now?
Yeah. So I was at VEVO. Again, very passionate about the work that we were doing, very passionate about what we were building as a brand and what we were building in terms of kind of a body of work. We'd found a very sweet spot within the industry of types of content that we were making, and we worked with anyone and everyone. But that same feeling I had at Lakewood, where it's like I feel there's something in me that like feels like it's time to move on,
Yep.
without being ready to move on, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, and I just decided that, like, rather than kind of squatting on this opportunity, I'd rather somebody else like have the opportunity that I had, and I'd rather just kind of like see what that next chapter looks like, knowing full well that possibly that could have ended, in some kind of colossal failure. But again, it's just like that idea of being sensitive to like when opportunity presents itself and being ready for that. I think about all this. I think about this all the time, which is early on. I remember my time between VEVO and Lakewood. I was ready for something. I was ready for something more, and I reached out, and pounded the pavement. I was in and out of LA and New York, just what felt like weekly.
Yeah.
And I think back at that time now, and I'm so thankful that the opportunities I wanted then weren't given to me then, because I don't know that I was ready for them. I I still had a lot of learning to do, and I still needed to kind of put in the hours. Um, this business is outside of the church world. This business is like, it's you're as good as the last thing that you did,
Yeah.
and there's such a demand on proficiency, and there's such a demand on like accuracy, um, that you need to be ready for the opportunity, because you don't get many opportunities to kind of like figure it out real time.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of been my path, the last like 7 or 8 years, is like knowing that I'm now in a place where, again, still learning, still growing, still trying to evolve as a director, but feeling the confidence that I needed to kind of build upon all these last years. So
That's great.
yeah, that's where I'm at the moment in the present time.
All right, so let's go back to young directors, guys that are just getting into multicam or relatively new. Give me some tips. What would you say? What are most of them doing wrong? What should they be thinking about? What Just give me some two or three real priorities that you'd encourage a young
Yeah.
multi-camera director to be thinking about.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, dude, first and foremost, dude, it seems so obvious, but it goes without saying, like you have to love this job, Um, directing is directing is oftentimes, riddled with like large levels of anxiety, with large demands on leadership, not just within your own team, but how you kind of manage up and how you deal with client, agent, outlet, whatever, um, you know, and you have to love the discipline of directing, um, first. And like that seems really, really crazy, but I feel like in an age of Instagram and social media, we put a high value on the output,
Yeah.
but we don't really know and understand what it took to kind of put that output into the world, and it is daunting. It's a massive hill to climb. And so I like anyone that is not in it for that level of work. Um, it's okay, but it goes without saying you have to love it.
Yeah.
Um, I think outside of that, one of the things I feel really, really passionate about, and we've seen this historically, we've seen this with musicians. I think church and the church environment is such a like opportunity to grow young creatives,
True.
and give them the opportunity to put in, Gladwell's 10,000 hours, where they can become very proficient in, not just calling cameras, but the dexterity of all that comes with being a director, which is like being a really, really good leader, being the kind of director that 65 to 150 people are like ready to follow.
Yeah.
Being confident in your language and your decision making, having a vision. Like the church is a really great opportunity for you to learn all of that, because you're instead of dealing with executives at HBO, you're dealing with the executive pastoral staff,
Yeah.
and sometimes like if you can deal with one, you can deal with the other, um, rather than dealing with a bunch of paid union operators. You're dealing with volunteers, and if you can get this group of people, um, not only to like get behind your vision, but to become better as individuals, then you can do that in a very taxing union environment with a bunch of guys who've been doing this for many, many years.
Yeah.
um, I think, in other words, like young directors, should really think about, like, rather than, it's easy to be at a church and be directing day in and day out and want something different, or like want to kind of move on because it's like, you don't have the Instagram clout that you want to have or whatever else. But I think rather than just darting away from it, if you're in this for the whole of your career,
Yeah.
um, and I believe this, and I say this to people often: you have nowhere to be. You know, you need to really understand, like, what are the things I need to get better at this year? What are the things I need to get better at next year? Maybe this year you're just working on how you communicate to like an executive team. Maybe the following year you're just working on how you communicate and lead your below the line team. And on and on and on, and just learning to like live in it and become undeniable. Like, if you're at a
Yeah.
church right now with 7 or 8 cameras, and you feel like, how in the world can I become, how can I get into these other partners, or like these other like platforms to direct, we, like, right now there's more live content opportunities than ever existed in the world, right? We have all of these streaming verticals, all of these streaming partners are now looking to get into live opportunity. They all have an appetite for live concert films. All of them have multi-camera shows in some capacity.
Yep.
Um, so A, the opportunities are really robust and rich right now, but B, if you just become an undeniable in the space, man, like, I never had to ask for a it's just not my MO to like ask for a raise or like ask for like a new thing. Like I just had my head down and I just did the work and I did it over and over and over again because it's just like how my mind works. And over time, people just kind of took notice in little ways, and I got a little more opportunity here and a little more opportunity there. And, ooh, that person replied to my email because they liked the reel that I sent to them, and on and on. It's just
Yeah.
like little bitty incremental wins. You can't go from you know small town church director position to CBS special.
Right.
There's no direct path there, and like the quicker you understand that, the better off you'll be. Sometimes you got to go hard left or right and get
Yeah.
some experience under your belt, to be able to approach that in a more like confident way.
That's great.
Um, yeah, so that would be my advice, man. It's just like being really undeniable in the thing you have right now. Don't worry about don't worry about 5 years from now. If you're undeniable for the next 5 years, I promise you, it's going to be great. But if you're just constantly thinking about what that looks like, and you've really phoned in what's in front of you, like, um, my feeling is that you're setting yourself up for, um, yeah, you're setting yourself up for what is A, not going to be as fulfilling, but B, potentially is not going to be you're not going to become as proficient as a director as you want to be.
That's fantastic. Well, let me ask you this before you go. You've done something I've never done as a director, and that is technology being what it is. You have the ability to direct concert events and not even be there. You're from across the country, right?
Yeah, 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 yeah.
I mean,
And I
but
think,
that's new for me. That's new. I remember emailing you. We were talking a year or so ago, and I think it was
mhm.
John. I think it was John Legend or somebody that you were shooting a concert with here in LA. And I said, well, tell me if he's a nice guy. And you said, I don't know. I'm in New York. I'll be directing from New York. That's kind of a weird experience.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, man, like with where we are technologically in within this environment, obviously that's not an ideal scenario, but
Right.
the capabilities exist insofar as like, uh, command centers and control rooms can be in one town, and the subject matter or the project can be in another town, and there's a seamless integration of both. I mean, that to me, even as a just an artful, not technical guy, like that's even mind blowing to me.
Yeah.
Um, but there's also something really, really fascinating about kind of being in the room with
I
the
agree.
artist, and like, you know what I mean, like looking
Totally.
and sort of again using not my vision per se, but like helping amplify the vision of the artist that you're working with in that way. And it's to me, it's very fulfilling. Yeah, I mean, I tell people like I have the second best job in the world. I don't get to be on stage, commanding the attention of thousands of people who are singing my music, but um, I get to come alongside artists and really support their vision. And um, you know, I'm not creating a car commercial. Like we get to put art into the world, and this performance art that we get to make is really, really
Yeah.
important. And it's I encourage anyone that has an interest in the space, man, is like there's room at the table for more people who want to be in live entertainment.
That's great.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah,
let me
yeah,
just say this before you go. I loved the fact that you said when you started your own company, you just started shooting bands who were friends of yours. And I that's a word I would put out to people listening or watching right now. You don't have to get a contract from a studio or a record
mm,
company. You could just go out and find somebody that who's a musician who's trying to break through, partner up with them and just go shoot something. I mean, we got these things in our pockets that
yeah,
I think there's a couple film festivals out there now with just movies shot
yeah.
on iPhones. So there's a way to get started without waiting. It frustrates me today with the tools that we have to meet people that are, well, Phil, I'm waiting for a deal, or I'm waiting for an
Right,
agent, or I'm waiting for a
right.
door open at the studio. No, no, no. Well, get out there and do it.
That's right. You don't need an agent. You don't need to like join a union. Like as a guy from Houston, Texas, who wasn't going to just wait for that invitation, like you're saying, like me and my buddies were just hungry to make stuff, and
Yeah.
we were willing to just make stuff on our own dime, in our own spare time, um, cold calling band. I mean, we cold called bands who we knew were off in Houston doing nothing, and just like hope for the best. And it's like that. Yeah, like you're saying, it's like those little bitty decisions. They don't take you from A to Z, but they do like get you down the path, and they do allow you to kind of put in your time. And so again, it goes back to that thing I said, like you have to love it. Like I don't do this. I don't do this because I love filmmaking per se. Like I do love the process, and I love the excitement of a project. Um, but I'm deeply, deeply passionate about music and supporting music visually and allowing that to kind of like permeate and kind of go out into the world. And so, for me, um, I if I had to be a filmmaker in other capacities, I don't know that it would be something that I would be interested in. But multi-camera is a tool. It's a mechanism that allows me to do this thing that I really really love, and it's been a really really good career for me. It's allowed me to travel the world. It's allowed me to meet many of my musical idols, and it's allowed me to kind of practice. Um, ministry and grace and love of other people in a way that's very like, yeah, it's very connected to who I am as a person. And so I'm very thankful. I'm very thankful to guys like you and to guys like John and Joel who again recognize a kid might have a vision for this kind of work, and just gave him the opportunity to do it. I'm forever grateful for that.
Well, you're incredibly kind, and I'm grateful that you'd come on. We may just do this again a few years down the road after you've achieved a few
Please.
big awards and done some
I
amazing
love it.
things. So, thanks again, and good luck in the future.
I love it. Phil, good to talk to you, man.
Take care. I'm so grateful that Micah would be on the program today. This is just really, really fantastic conversation. He's doing so well in his career, and I'm very proud of what he's accomplishing. And just remember, one big thing, discovering what you were born to do. Go to Amazon, go to barnesandnoble.com, wherever books are sold. You can get your copy, and it'll really help you if you're struggling trying to figure out, what am I supposed to do with my life? What is my purpose? What was I put on the earth to accomplish? It can make a big difference for you. One big thing, discovering what you were born to do. And I'll see you next week.